Aisha always believed marriage was about teamwork, about holding each other up in hard times. But one morning at breakfast, her whole world shifted. Musa, her husband, looked across the table with a strange calmness and said he had quit his job. No warning, no discussion. Then, with a smirk, he pushed his plate away and added, "You'll support us now." For a moment, Aisha thought she had misheard him. Her hands froze around her cup, and her heart pounded in her chest. She had spent years building her fashion business from nothing, late nights, early mornings, sweat and sacrifice. And now, Musa wanted to sit back and enjoy the rewards without lifting a finger. She searched his face, hoping it was a joke, but the smug expression told her he meant every word. Anger and disbelief rushed through her veins, but beneath it all was something colder, betrayal. This wasn't the man she thought she had married, the man who once cheered her on. Slowly, she placed her cup down and shook her head. "No," she said, her voice steady even as her stomach turned. It was just one word, but it carried the weight of everything she stood for, her independence, her hard work, her dignity. Musa's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. In that moment, Aisha realized she had drawn a line, and crossing it would ignite a battle she never imagined she would have to fight. Musa did not take Aisha's "no" like a man who understood. From that morning on, the house no longer felt like home. Days stretched into weeks filled with silence so heavy it pressed against her chest. He would sit across from her at dinner and say nothing, only stabbing his food with slow anger in his eyes. When he did speak, his words carried poison, sarcasm about how she thought she was better than him now, or how she cared more about her business than her marriage. Every glance felt like an accusation, every sigh like a punishment. The man who once laughed with her now looked at her as if she were his enemy. The whispers from family made it worse. His sisters and cousins started dropping hints when they visited. They would smile politely at Aisha, but their words cut deep. A woman should support her husband. Marriage is about sacrifice. And the harshest one of all, she is too selfish to be a real wife. Aisha knew exactly where those whispers came from, Musa's own mouth. He was painting her as the villain, and the gossip spread like wildfire. But Aisha refused to bend. She had worked too hard, survived too much, to throw away her self-respect now. When she looked in the mirror, she reminded herself that she was not the selfish one. She was simply asking for partnership, for balance, for respect. If standing her ground made her the bad wife, then so be it. Still, the unease never left her. She began to notice the change in his eyes. They were darker now, colder, watching her every move. Sometimes she would catch him staring when he thought she wasn't looking, and a chill would run down her spine. It wasn't just disappointment she saw, it was calculation. He didn't explode in anger the way some men might. Instead, he stayed quiet, holding it in, letting it fester. That silence was louder than any shout, more dangerous than any fight. At night, when the house was quiet and the city outside had gone to sleep, Aisha would lie awake listening to the sound of rain against the windows, wondering what Musa was plotting in his head. He had always been proud, but now his pride was wounded, and wounded pride was unpredictable. She could feel it in the way he moved, the way he lingered on his phone with hushed tones, the way he left the room when she entered. Everywhere she turned, the shadow of his resentment followed her. At the boutique, she worked with a smile for her customers, but inside she carried a knot of fear. At family gatherings, she wore her strongest face, even as the whispers echoed in her ears. And at home, she carried herself with grace, though her heart beat faster each time Musa's cold eyes met hers. Deep down, Aisha knew this battle was only beginning. He was not a man who would let rejection rest. Something in his silence, in the sharpness of his smirk, told her the storm was coming. And though she stood tall, a voice inside her whispered the truth she didn't want to admit: this fight with Musa was far from over. It started with small things that Aisha almost ignored. Late at night, when the house was dark and quiet, she would hear Musa's voice in the living room, low and hurried on the phone. But the moment she stepped out, the conversation would end, and he would slip the phone into his pocket as if nothing had happened. At first, she told herself it was harmless, maybe just him talking to friends. But the pattern never stopped. Every time she appeared, the calls ended. Every time she asked, he brushed it off with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Then came the money. One morning, while balancing her accounts for the boutique, Aisha noticed a strange withdrawal. It wasn't much, just enough to make her pause. She thought maybe it was a mistake. But days later, there was another one, and then another. Each time it was the same, money gone, no explanation. When she asked Musa, his answers were quick and careless, like he was offended she had even noticed. "You worry too much," he said, but the knot in her stomach told her otherwise. This wasn't carelessness. It was deliberate. Soon, his brothers began showing up at the house more often, their faces full of fake smiles and greedy eyes. They would sit on her couch, drinking tea, talking about how Musa was the man of the house and deserved comfort. Some of them even hinted that Aisha's success was family property, that her boutique was their brother's blessing. She listened in silence, her jaw tight, knowing every word was rehearsed. They weren't just visiting, they were testing her, pressing her, reminding her that Musa had a whole army standing behind him. The more she watched, the clearer it became. Musa wasn't just sulking because she had refused to support him. He was planning something bigger, something uglier. The late-night whispers, the missing money, the sudden boldness of his brothers, it all pointed to one truth. Aisha wasn't living with a husband nursing wounded pride. She was living with a man preparing to take what wasn't his. Her chest grew heavy with the realization. The marriage she once thought was built on love had turned into a trap. She replayed every moment in her mind, the smirk at breakfast, the silent glares, the gossip spread by his family. They had been steps, each one leading to this point. Musa wasn't just angry that she had said no. He wanted to break her, to strip her of everything she had built, to make her depend on him by force if he couldn't win her trust. Every sign was now a warning bell, loud and clear. Aisha's instincts screamed that danger was closer than she wanted to admit. Her home no longer felt safe, her marriage no longer felt real. And deep inside, she knew the truth, Musa wasn't only jobless. He was plotting, and the target was her. That night, Accra was drowning in heavy rain. The sound of thunder rolled through the sky as water beat against the windows like endless drums. Aisha had finally drifted into uneasy sleep after another long day at the boutique, but something pulled her awake. At first, she thought it was the storm. Then she heard it, metal scraping against metal. Her eyes shot open, her body stiff as ice. She turned her head slowly toward the clock on the bedside table. The red numbers glowed in the darkness, 3:13 a.m. Her heart stopped. Nobody should have been at the door at that hour. The sound came again, sharper this time. It was the lock. The spare key. Aisha's blood ran cold. She sat up in bed, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. Instinct told her not to make a sound, not to breathe too loudly. With one quick movement, she opened the camera and pressed record. The phone shook in her grip, but she kept it steady, raising it toward the door. The scraping stopped. Then, slowly, the knob turned. The door creaked open, and the darkness of the hall spilled into the room. Aisha's breath grew shallow, her chest rising and falling as quietly as possible. She could hear soft whispers, low voices trying not to be heard over the rain. Her eyes widened as shadows moved through the doorway. It wasn't just Musa. Two of his cousins slipped inside with him. They thought the storm would hide their crime, but they didn't know Aisha was awake, watching, recording every step. She clutched the phone tighter, forcing herself not to scream. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure they would hear it. Musa's voice was barely above a whisper, but she caught the words. "We'll take what's ours tonight. She won't stop us this time." His cousins nodded, moving quietly toward the living room. Aisha's stomach twisted. This was no longer suspicion. This was betrayal in motion, unfolding right in front of her eyes. Every second felt like an hour as she stayed frozen in the shadows of her room, recording the proof that would change everything. Her hands were sweaty, her throat dry, but she didn't dare move. The men opened cupboards, checked drawers, whispering about money, jewelry, and documents. Musa stood tall, his smirk clear even in the dim light, as if he was finally taking what he believed belonged to him. Aisha's fear slowly turned into something stronger. Courage. She realized that the very moment Musa thought she was weak was the moment she would rise. Her phone was capturing it all, the trespassing, the theft, the betrayal of the man who once promised to protect her. She knew the danger was real, but so was her resolve. At 3:13 a.m., while the city of Accra slept under heavy rain, Aisha made a silent promise to herself. This night would not break her. This night would expose him. And as the lock clicked shut behind them, she knew the trap had already begun to close. The moment Aisha saw them, her chest tightened so hard she thought she couldn't breathe. Musa wasn't alone. Two of his cousins moved quickly behind him, slipping inside like shadows, their wet slippers leaving marks on the floor from the rain outside. They thought they were invisible, but the camera in Aisha's trembling hand saw everything. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering as their whispers floated through the dark. "Tonight we take what's ours," one cousin muttered, his voice sharp with greed. Aisha's stomach twisted. Ours? They were talking about her home, her business, her hard-earned life, as if it was theirs to claim. She watched Musa with wide, stinging eyes. Her husband, the man she once trusted with her future, was now leading them like a thief in his own house. He moved with confidence, as if he had every right, pointing toward the drawers, the cupboards, the safe corner where she kept her documents. "She doesn't need all this," he whispered. "She'll have nothing left to fight with." His cousins snickered, their faces lit up with hunger for money and control. Every word, every movement was being caught clearly on her phone, their betrayal carved into proof that could never be denied. Aisha's hands shook, but she held the phone steady. She couldn't believe the man who once promised to protect her was now plotting to destroy her. Musa's voice was calm, almost proud, like this was his victory. But all she felt was fire in her veins. Fear and heartbreak turned into something sharper, strength. She wasn't just witnessing betrayal. She was documenting it. She was turning their crime into their downfall. The men whispered about selling her jewelry, about draining her accounts, about how Musa would finally put her in her place. Each word stabbed deeper than a knife. But Aisha stayed silent, her breath shallow, her mind focused. They thought she was asleep. They thought she was powerless. They thought she would wake up to an empty home and broken spirit. What they didn't know was that their downfall was already in motion. As they moved from room to room, she followed their reflections in the dim light, capturing their faces, their greedy smiles, the way Musa gave orders like a commander. She wanted to scream, to ask him how he could betray her like this, but she forced herself to wait. Patience was her weapon. Evidence was her shield. She had to let them dig their own grave, and they were digging fast. Finally, as they gathered near the door, Musa whispered, "This is just the beginning. Tomorrow, she'll know who really controls this house." Aisha's heart burned, but her lips stayed sealed. Little did they know, tomorrow he wouldn't control anything. Tomorrow, the world would see who he truly was. And tomorrow, the same phone he ignored every night would become the key to his downfall. The rain had stopped by dawn, but Aisha's heart was still racing as she stepped out of her house. The streets of Accra were wet and shining under the weak morning sun. She clutched her phone tightly in her hand, the video saved and backed up, her evidence safe. Each step toward the police station felt heavy but powerful, like she was carrying not just her own pain but also her freedom. People around her were starting their day, carrying baskets, calling taxis, rushing to work, but Aisha's morning was different. Today, she wasn't going to open her boutique. Today, she was going to take back her life. When she walked into the police station, the air was cold, filled with the smell of wet uniforms and paper. The officer at the desk looked up, ready to dismiss her like so many women before, but Aisha didn't flinch. She placed her phone on the counter, unlocked the screen, and pressed play. The whispers filled the room. Musa's voice, his cousins plotting, their greedy laughter in the middle of the night. The officer's eyes widened as the video played, showing faces, words, and actions too clear to deny. By the time it ended, there was no room for doubt. Aisha had walked in with the truth, and the truth was louder than anything Musa could say. By noon, the trap had snapped shut. Musa and his cousins were no longer sneaking through doors, they were standing in handcuffs, surrounded by police officers. His smirk, the one that had haunted her for weeks, was gone. In its place was panic. His eyes darted around, searching for escape, but there was none. The same man who once sat at her table demanding she support him was now begging for mercy, his voice shaking as charges were read aloud: conspiracy, theft, trespassing. Every word was like justice being carved into stone. Aisha stood there, watching. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to gloat. Her silence was stronger than any insult, her calmness sharper than any revenge. Musa looked at her then, his face pale, his mouth trembling. "Aisha, please," he said, as if begging could erase the betrayal, as if words could undo the night she had recorded. But she didn't move. She didn't answer. She simply turned her back on him and walked away, each step steady and unshaken. For once, the roles had reversed. Musa was the one trapped, exposed, powerless. And Aisha, the woman he thought he could break, was the one holding the power. She walked out of that station with her head high, the weight on her shoulders finally lifting. The war he started had ended, not with her defeat, but with his downfall. What he planned as her ruin had become his own undoing, and Aisha was finally free. Word of Musa's arrest spread through the community faster than fire catching on dry grass. By evening, everyone knew the story. The video had done its job, it left no space for lies, no room for excuses. The same family members who once whispered behind Aisha's back, calling her selfish and cold, now avoided her eyes. Their voices, once loud and judgmental, turned silent. Not one of them could defend Musa after seeing him sneaking into his wife's house with cousins like common thieves. The shame was too heavy, and it belonged entirely to them. Aisha walked through the market one morning and felt the stares, but this time, they were different. The women who had once pitted Musa for having a stubborn wife, now looked at Aisha with quiet respect. They whispered not about her failures but about her strength. Some even nodded at her, small gestures of solidarity that told her she was no longer the villain in their stories. She wasn't the selfish wife anymore. She was the woman who stood up for herself when most would have bowed their heads. Musa's family tried to recover, but the truth had destroyed the mask they wore. His brothers, the same ones who came into her house demanding comfort and entitlement, now walked with their heads low. Neighbors who used to sit with them kept their distance. The betrayal had left a stain that no excuses could wash away. Aisha didn't have to argue anymore. The evidence spoke louder than gossip ever could. When she finally filed for divorce, it was not a secret, and it was not a scandal. People didn't whisper that she had abandoned her husband. They didn't say she had failed at marriage. Instead, they spoke of her courage, her dignity, and her strength. They said she chose freedom over chains, truth over lies. For the first time in a long time, Aisha felt the weight on her shoulders lifting. The day she signed the papers, she sat quietly in the lawyer's office, her pen moving steadily across the page. There was no hesitation in her hand, no fear in her chest. Musa had taken enough from her, but he would not take her future. When she walked out, the air felt fresher, the sun brighter. It was as if the city itself was congratulating her, reminding her that she was free at last. The community saw it too. They didn't see a broken marriage, they saw a woman reclaiming her life piece by piece. They saw a woman who refused to be silenced, who turned betrayal into proof, who turned pain into power. And as for Musa's family, their silence was the loudest sound of all. They had called her selfish, but in the end, Aisha had proven that saving yourself is never selfish, it is survival. Months later, Aisha stood in the center of her new boutique, the sunlight pouring through the wide glass windows and dancing across the bright fabrics she had designed with her own hands. The shop was alive with chatter as customers admired her work, touching the clothes with excitement, praising her talent. The air smelled of new fabric and fresh beginnings. For the first time in a long while, her heart felt light, her shoulders free from the heavy shadow Musa had cast over her. She watched her customers with quiet pride, her lips curving into a smile that came from deep within. Every stitch, every design, every success was hers alone. As she leaned against the counter, she remembered that night, the sound of the spare key scraping in the lock at 3:13 a.m., the fear that nearly crushed her chest, and the betrayal that cut deeper than any wound. But instead of pain, the memory now gave her strength. What had been meant to break her had built her instead. Aisha had survived the storm, and she had done more than survive, she had risen. She had turned his betrayal into her victory, his plot into her proof, his cruelty into her freedom. Musa, once so proud and certain, had been left with nothing but regret. He learned too late that when you try to steal from a lioness, you don't just fail, you get devoured. And as Aisha welcomed another happy customer through the door, her heart whispered the truth she already knew, she was untouchable.